Arthur's Family Truth. At 3:51 a.m., I was standing inside my shop in the dark while a man I'd never seen before slammed a crowbar into my front door. The first hit cracked the glass. The second shook the frame. By the third, I heard him yell, "He already paid me, I'm getting in." That's when I knew this wasn't random. My own son had sent him. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't shout. I called 911 and kept watching. I thought it was over. I was wrong. The man didn't run. He kept hitting my door. And then a white SUV turned the corner. I stayed where I was, still in the dark, watching everything unfold. The man was still gripping the crowbar. That's when the SUV doors opened. He said this would be easy, he said. Not she, not they, he. My son Darren stepped out of the driver's side. His wife Tiffany came around the other. She already had that expression on her face, calm, controlled, like she belonged there. I gave the dispatcher the address in a low voice. Gave her the address in a low voice. She said 2 minutes. I moved back into the shadows and waited. 3 cruisers showed up in under 90 seconds. Charlotte PD doesn't mess around on commercial break-ins at that hour. The man dropped the crowbar and went straight to his knees before the officers even finished pulling up. I walked out, unlocked the front, and stepped onto the sidewalk. Tiffany reached the officers first. She told them they'd gotten a security alert on their phones and rushed straight over. She said it with complete confidence, like she was doing everyone a favor by showing up. There was just one problem with that story. There were no cameras linked to their phones. I'd removed Darren from every system and account in the shop 3 months earlier, the same week I caught him running payroll through a side account I'd never authorized. He thought I hadn't noticed. I'd noticed. I just didn't say anything yet. That's a habit I picked up from my father. Know what you know and decide when to use it. Tiffany kept talking to the officers. Soft voice, sympathetic eyes. She told them the man with the crowbar was probably confused, probably homeless. Probably just looking for food or a warm place to sleep. She said I sometimes left the side door unlocked and maybe he got the wrong idea. She said there was no need to press charges and ruin someone's life over a broken door. I stood there with my arms crossed and let her perform. Then Darren stepped directly in front of me, put his body between me and the officer I was about to address. Told me to let it go. Said it was just a door. Said we could pay to fix it out of the shop account and nobody needed to make it a whole thing. I looked at him for a moment. This is the kid I co-signed an apartment for when he was 23. Taught him to change his own oil right in that parking lot. Put him through 4 years of college. He was standing there in a jacket that cost more than my first engine lift, defending a man he'd supposedly never seen before in his life. Before I could say a word, the man on the ground laughed. Short and hard. He looked directly at Darren. "You owe me $5,000. And your wife said there'd be extra if the old sign came down." The sidewalk went dead quiet. I watched Darren's face go pale. Tiffany's hand shot to his arm. The 2 officers who'd been nodding sympathetically at her stopped nodding. One of them reached for his notepad. They took the man's phone. The texts were from a burner, no direct name trace. But it didn't matter. Something had shifted on that sidewalk, and all of us standing there felt it. The police processed the man for vandalism. Darren and Tiffany were free to go, no charges, no formal questioning. They walked back to their SUV, like they'd just wrapped up a minor inconvenience. Tiffany even managed a small smile at one of the officers before she got in. I stood on the sidewalk and watched them drive away, then I went back inside, made a fresh cup of coffee, and called my attorney. 3 weeks later, Darren called a family dinner at my sister Carolyn's place. I knew what it was before I walked in the door. When you've been around long enough, you recognize the setup. The room was already arranged. Cousins who usually ignored me were suddenly very interested in their plates. Carolyn gave me a smile instead of a hug. Darren and Tiffany had arrived first, and they'd done their work. Tiffany was dressed down for the occasion, no jewelry, muted colors. She sat close to Darren and dabbed at her eyes whenever anyone glanced her way. She'd built a whole narrative in the weeks since the break-in that I was paranoid, controlling, that I'd always resented Darren's ambition, that I was weaponizing the police against my own family over a broken door. Half the table had already bought it by the time the food was served. After we ate, Darren reached into his jacket and dropped a thick stack of documents on the table. He'd filed paperwork to trademark the name Lawson's Garage under a new LLC he'd incorporated, Darren Lawson Enterprises. He laid it out like he was presenting a business plan to investors. Told me I could either sign over the building voluntarily or he'd file an injunction and stop me from using my own name in commerce. A couple of my cousins nodded like he'd just said something smart. Tiffany looked at me from across the table with an expression that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a threat. Somewhere in between, I let Darren finish talking. Then, I reached into my jacket pocket and placed one sheet of paper on the table. Slid it past the bread basket, past the gravy, right in front of his plate. It was a cease and desist letter drafted by my corporate attorney the day after the break-in. I kept it simple. The sign above the door says Lawson's Garage, always has. But the legal entity that owns the building, the accounts, the equipment, and every service contract in that shop is registered as Lawson Property Holdings, LLC, incorporated in 1994. He'd spent real money trademarking a nickname. The actual operating company was untouched. You trademarked a sign, I said, not a company. He stared at the paper. The table went quiet. Tiffany's expression shifted just for a second before she locked it back down. Nobody said much after that. Carolyn offered dessert. I declined and drove home. Within 2 weeks, Darren had moved to Plan B. He tracked down a commercial leasing company called Apex Commercial Management that handled several properties on my block. He and Tiffany went in, signed a 10-year lease on the Lawson's garage space, and paid $25,000 up front to secure it. They came back with a camera crew, a ring light, a cameraman, and an eviction notice. Tiffany walked my shop on a live stream, pointing at my tool bays and calling the place dated. Said she was going to transform it into Serenity Wellness Studio. Facials, massage, organic treatments. Said the neighborhood deserved something elevated. Darren laid the eviction notice on my workbench and told me I had 2 hours to clear out personal items before they took over. I didn't argue. I found a small cardboard box, packed my father's photograph from the desk, his original torque wrench from 1978, the one he used to tune his first customer's engine, my coffee mug. I carried the box out the front door, walked past the camera without looking at it, and got in my truck. Darren called after me from the doorway. That easy? You're just done? I didn't answer. Here's what neither of them had bothered to check. Apex Commercial Management is a wholly owned subsidiary of Lawson Property Holdings, LLC. They had handed $25,000 directly into my corporate account to rent my own building. I want to be clear about one thing, because I know how this sounds. I didn't set up the corporate structure to trap my son. I built Lawson Property Holdings in the mid-90s because a good mechanic named Curtis who mentored me told me never to own real estate in your personal name. Keep the business in the business, he said. I've followed that advice for 30 years. The structure existed long before any of this started. Darren walked into it because he never asked how anything worked. He just assumed that because I fix cars for a living, I didn't understand contracts. That assumption cost him everything. Now, I did know about one other thing, and I'll be honest that I held it back on purpose. About 3 years before all this, I discovered that Darren had forged my signature on the guarantor documents for his house, a $650,000 property in a suburb south of Charlotte. He didn't have the credit score to close on it alone, so he signed my name to the mortgage paperwork and tied my corporate credit to the loan without ever asking me. I found out within 6 months of him doing it. I contacted the lender quietly, documented everything, and kept the file in my safe. I'm not proud of sitting on it that long, but I wanted to see how things played out. A man who forges his father's signature doesn't do it once. I figured the right time to use it would eventually show itself. It did. The grand opening of Serenity Wellness Studio was scheduled for a Saturday in January. I parked across the street at 10 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and watched through the windshield. They'd gutted the place, ripped out the original tool bays, painted everything white and gray, installed pendant lighting they'd hardwired directly into my electrical panel, no permits, no inspection, no contractor, license on file with the city. The sidewalk had a rented carpet runner. A balloon arch framed the front door. Tiffany was inside in a silk blouse, walking around with her phone on a selfie stick, telling her followers she'd rescued the space from decades of neglect. About 40 minutes in, with the studio packed and the cameras rolling, the lights cut out, then the water stopped. I'd filed a detailed complaint with the Charlotte Building Department 9 days earlier. Unpermitted electrical work, unpermitted plumbing modifications, structural alterations to a commercial property without owner authorization. I included photographs, permit records, and a signed statement from Lawson Property Holdings as the property owner of record. The city scheduled an inspection for that Saturday morning. I didn't mention that part to anyone. The fire safety inspector walked through the front door about 4 minutes after the utilities went down. He had a clipboard, a yellow vest, and zero interest in Tiffany's follower count. He checked the electrical panel, checked the plumbing connections to the new spa tubs they'd installed in the back, and started writing. Darren came at him fast, red in the face, voice raised, demanding to know who authorized the inspection and why his business was being shut down on opening day. The inspector didn't raise his voice back. He just handed Darren the citation sheet and pointed to the contact line at the bottom. Property owner filed the complaint, he said. Lawson Property Holdings. Address and phone number are right there if you want to follow up. Darren read the name on the citation 3 times. I could see his lips moving from across the street. He called me within 60 seconds. I let it go to voicemail. They drove to my office building downtown about an hour later. I was already upstairs. My assistant Nadine called up when they hit the lobby. I told her to send them to the top floor and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. I was sitting behind my desk when the elevator opened down the hall. I could hear Darren before I could see him, that particular tone he gets when he's trying to sound in control but isn't. Tiffany was sharper, more clipped. She'd already switched into damage control mode. They came through the door and stopped. Darren scanned the room the way people do when reality doesn't match what they expected. The desk, the window view of uptown Charlotte, the framed property deeds on the wall, the nameplate, Randall Lawson Property Holdings, LLC. He stood there for a few seconds without saying anything. Tiffany looked at the nameplate, looked at me, looked back at the nameplate. I gestured to the 2 chairs across from my desk. Sit down. They sat. I opened the lease agreement they'd signed with Apex Commercial Management and walked them through the corporate structure one step at a time. Apex is a subsidiary. The parent company is Lawson Property Holdings. They had signed a binding commercial lease with my own company without knowing it. Their rent was $8,000 a month. First payment was 30 days past due. I don't offer extensions to tenants in default. Darren said I'd planned the whole thing to humiliate him. You planned this, I said. I just own the building. Tiffany pulled out her phone right there in my office and recorded a 3-minute video for her followers, crying, shaking, told them I was an abusive landlord, that I'd sabotaged their business out of spite, that I'd always resented Darren's success. She posted it before she stood up from the chair. Within an hour, my business pages were getting flooded with messages from strangers who didn't know me and didn't know the first thing about what had happened. I turned my phone face down on the desk and let it buzz. What Tiffany didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because she never looked past the surface of anything, was that her situation was about to get significantly worse. After the spa failure, she started pitching investors. She needed capital to relocate, to rebuild, to prove she could pull it off without my building. She hit rejection after rejection. Word travels fast in Charlotte's commercial real estate circles, and a botched grand opening followed by a city shutdown is not a resume builder. Banks passed, equity groups didn't return calls. Then a company called Vanguard Trust reached out to her by email, positioned itself as a private wealth management group looking to fund wellness brands with strong social media presence, offered $800,000 in startup capital, fast approval, flexible terms, or so the summary page made it look. The actual loan covenant, buried about 14 pages in, allowed Vanguard to seize all personal assets on the first missed payment, with no cure period. Tiffany signed everything in 4 days, didn't show it to a lawyer, didn't show it to her father, sent the notarized documents back by courier and started making plans. She came to my office lobby one afternoon to tell me about it in person, said she didn't need me or my building anymore, said real money was coming and I could enjoy my little garage. She turned and walked out through the glass doors like she'd just won something. I went back upstairs and opened the portfolio my attorney had dropped off that morning. Vanguard Trust is mine. Has been for 11 years. The Vanguard loan default triggered automatically when Darren and Tiffany missed their first payment. I didn't have to make a single phone call. The covenant did the work. The lender moved on the house the following week. County sheriffs showed up on a Tuesday morning with a court order and gave them 60 minutes to remove personal belongings. The bank had already frozen the accounts tied to the fraudulent mortgage, the one Darren had secured 3 years earlier using my forged signature as guarantor. I'd reported that forgery to the lender the morning after Tiffany walked out of my lobby smiling. The timing wasn't an accident. I'd held that file in my safe for 3 years waiting for the right moment. That was the right moment. They came out of that house with garbage bags, 6 of them. hauling clothes and shoes across the front lawn while the neighbors watched from the sidewalk. The cars were gone too, both leased, both tied to the same frozen accounts. Tiffany's father, Howard Aldridge, showed up in a Bentley. She ran toward him across the lawn expecting a rescue. He stepped out of the car and told her instead that he was broke, had been for 6 months. His commercial real estate company had collapsed, and he'd taken a private emergency loan to stay afloat. He'd kept it hidden from everyone, including her. The loan was from Vanguard Trust. Howard looked across the lawn at me and gave one slow nod. He knew exactly who I was by then. The legal process moved quickly after that. My attorney submitted a formal historical asset appraisal covering 2 items destroyed in the break-in: my father's original 1971 neon shop sign and his 1978 tool set, both registered as certified American trade heritage artifacts through a craftsman's preservation registry. My father had enrolled them in decades ago. Combined appraisal? $45,000. That figure pushed the destruction charge across the federal felony threshold for commercial property crimes in North Carolina. The misdemeanor vandalism charge Darren thought he was going to walk away with a $200 fine and some community service was upgraded to a Class A federal felony carrying up to 15 years. Darren understood then that he had one move left. He contacted the federal prosecutor's office and offered full cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. He handed over everything, the cloud backup from their shared account that contained every text Tiffany had sent from the burner phone, floor plans of the shop she'd forwarded to the man they hired, confirmation messages, payment records. A voice memo of her walking through the plan the night before the break-in. She had documented her own crime in detail because she never imagined anyone would find it. The family court signed the emergency custody order for my granddaughter Amber the same week the federal charges were filed. Darren didn't contest it. He was in no position to contest anything. I drove to pick Amber up on a Wednesday afternoon. She was 6 years old, sitting on a suitcase in the front hallway of a house that no longer belonged to her parents, holding a stuffed rabbit with one ear. She looked up at me and said, "Grandpa, are we going to your garage?" I told her yes. We could go to the garage. The federal trial lasted 4 days. I testified on the second day, kept it factual, walked the jury through the timeline, the corporate structure, the asset appraisal, the loan documents. No speeches, no emotion, just the sequence of events in the order they happened. The defense tried to paint me as a controlling father who'd engineered a trap. I told them the corporate structure had existed since 1994 and handed them the incorporation documents. They didn't have much to say after that. The jury came back in under 2 hours, guilty on all counts. Both of them. 15 years federal facility, no parole consideration for 10. Darren didn't look at me when the verdict was read. Tiffany did for just a second, and then she looked away. That was 14 months ago. Lawson's garage is back open. I replaced the front door with a restoration piece that matches the original 1971 frame. The neon sign is a replica built by the same craftsman family that made the first one. It looks exactly the way it did when my father flipped it on for the first time. Some of the old regulars didn't even know anything had happened. They just showed up for their oil changes and asked where I'd been. I told them I took a few months off. Amber has been with me the whole time. She started school in September, 2 blocks from the shop, and she walks over after class most days. She sits on an overturned bucket in Bay 2 and does her homework while I work. Last Saturday, she sorted a jar of bolts by size without being asked. She said she was organizing inventory. I didn't correct her. I just handed her a second jar. She's got her grandmother's laugh. Loud and sudden, like it surprises even her. I think about what Darren and Tiffany thought they saw when they looked at me. A quiet man with grease under his fingernails who didn't understand how the real world worked. A man who could be pushed out of his own building with a piece of paper and a camera crew. They figured that because I work with my hands, I didn't understand contracts. Because I drive an old truck, I didn't have leverage. Because I didn't argue back, I must not have had anything left to say. Every assumption they made was wrong, and they paid for every one of them. My father used to say, "Own the ground you stand on, and stand on it quietly." I spent 30 years doing exactly that. Darren spent 3 years trying to take it in 3 different ways, and every time he reached for it, he found out it was already accounted for. They assumed quiet meant weak. Turns out quiet just means you're not wasting words on people who haven't earned them yet. The shop is open 6 days a week. Amber has a shelf in the back office for her backpack. The sign out front still says Lawson's always will. If this story meant something to you, hit like and leave a comment below. And if you know someone who's ever had to protect what they built from the people closest to them, share this with them. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.